Hi, my name is Alex Weeman. I'm a third-year occupational therapy capstone student, and today I will be presenting on loss and grief. In particular, I will be relating these back into how they relate to stroke. What exactly is loss? Loss can take many forms. Loss of a loved one, loss of function, loss of routines, loss of self-identity, and loss of autonomy are just a few examples. Loss can be caused by global events as well, such as COVID-19. This can lead to loss of normalcy on a massive scale. Loss can lead to uncertainty and anxiety as well as a variety of emotions. Anger is one common emotion that can be felt, just like sadness, fearfulness, and other emotions. Having a stroke can cause significant loss, including loss of chosen occupations, loss of previous relationships, loss of identity, loss of independence, and many other things. For example, aphasia is often associated with significant loss. With this one deficit, survivors can experience loss of communication, independence, relationships, and identity, just to name a few things. All of this is ultimately associated with stress, depression, anxiety, and difficulty coping. Furthermore, loss is not unique to survivors, as care partners experience loss as well when transitioning into their new roles. Finally, loss of any kind typically turns to grief. Grief is the response to loss. This can incorporate physical, emotional, behavioral, spiritual, or cognitive responses. Some of the emotional responses associated with grief include shock, anger, longing, guilt, sadness, pain, and depression. Additionally, physical symptoms can be experienced as well, such as having fatigue, having a tight chest, or having trouble sleeping, eating, or concentrating. Mourning is slightly different from grief, in that it is the expression of grief during the psychological processing of loss. This can often have a social or cultural component as well, as this is often an outward expression. Another term I wanted to discuss here is ambiguous loss, which is a loss that is hard to identify and understand. This can result in a mix of emotional responses all at once. For example, a stroke may result in losses that are hard to specify, making it difficult to comprehend exactly how to react. Experiencing loss interrupts plans for a person's idealized future. Grief can therefore lead to fear of future loss. This causes anticipatory grief, or grieving for a loss that is yet to happen. Survivors of stroke can sometimes feel anticipatory grief if they feel as if they will have another stroke. With anticipatory grief, people imagine their futures a certain way and will adopt a mindset that can prevent them from living functionally. For example, with COVID-19, people hoarded food and toiletries because they believed preventing their deaths would be dependent on having those things. Anticipating another stroke could cause an individual to center their mindset on negative emotions and death, which could keep them from living in the present. As stated earlier, care partners often experience grief as well following their loved ones having a stroke. Following a stroke, survivors and care partners often feel uncertain about everyday life, and this influences their emotional health. Care partners sometimes have found loss after a stroke because their loved ones often exhibit different personalities, cognition, and life roles from what they knew before. In other words, some care partners lost much of the person they had known before, and this leads to the same emotional shock that is caused by any ambiguous loss. They experience additional anxiety from considering the potential of another stroke, which would be considered anticipatory grief, as we discussed before. This causes care partners to retreat socially and stay home with the concern of being one step ahead of a potential stroke happening again, and with the hope of minimizing risks. Care partners sometimes need education that another stroke cannot be controlled. The recommendation for these care partners is to take things one day at a time in order to help avert their attention from obsessing on how bleak the future could potentially be, an unwilling obsession which has riddled them with anticipatory grief. Now I want to take some time to look at some different theories about grief. One popular theory about how grief works is the 5 stages of grief. The stages of this include denial, or specifically denying the loss has occurred, anger, bargaining, or thinking of what should have been done to change the loss from happening, or even thinking of deals they would make now to reverse their loss, depression, and acceptance. A person can go through these stages in different orders despite popular understanding, and some people feel that they do not experience some of the stages at all. While the theory remains a point of contention, many people find it as a helpful guide to what their journey through grief could be like. The denial phase can be a notably challenging phase for survivors of stroke, as they sometimes believe they were unaffected and can participate in the same life activities the way they previously did. Grief can also have a positive effect in the acceptance stage. When we recognize the fragility of life, it can make us humble and appreciate the good things around us. Meaning has been proposed as the sixth stage of the grieving process. It would entail attaching meaning to the circumstances of grief, almost as a way of finally processing and growing through the experience. Another theory with stages is the 4 tasks of loss. These 4 tasks include accepting the loss, working through the pain, adjusting, and moving on. Similar to the 5 stages, these tasks can be completed out of order as well. These tasks differ in that the first task listed is acceptance, implying these tasks largely occur even after the 5 stages of grief are completed. This implies that the journey towards moving on happens even long after we learn to accept the loss, as the process transforms into a new challenge of adjustment. Another theory with stages is the stages of crisis, which includes shock, retreat/denial, realization, and acknowledgement. Shock is typically the first stage in loss. This is often characterized by feelings of surprise and being overwhelmed. Retreat or denial is a common stage in response to loss, as they are tied to the emotional components of grief. This stage is often exhibited by family and care partners after a loved one changed due to a stroke. Realization is a stage that follows denial, and it entails coming to grasp with the extent and implications of loss. This is when survivors and family start to look at the future and are more ready and able to understand and receive treatment and prognosis information. The acknowledgement stage is when a sense of normalcy starts to set in. They still experience challenges and reminders of loss and grief as they attempt to return to prior roles and occupations, and grief can still manifest. It often feels more like a dull ache sometimes, but also can still manifest in a sharp emotional way. One additional theory is the concept of growing with the grief. This theory contrasts the concept of our grief and loss fading over time. Rather, the theory states that grief remains unaffected, and initially, our grief may consume us and be a huge part of who we are. Over time, however, while that grief may remain unaffected, we continue to grow around it so that it does not make up such a huge part of our lives anymore. While it remains in us, we are able to build around it and move on. Again, I want to reiterate that despite common framing of loss as healing over time, the actual size of the loss does not change. Rather, people adapt to loss and develop coping strategies over time. It's this time that it takes to adapt and cope that is referred to as the bereavement phase. Another theory that is important to mention is the dual process model. This theory states that the bereaved alternate between phases of focusing on their loss and phases of positive continuation of their lives. For example, someone might need time by themselves occasionally to let out their emotions and reflect on their loss. But then at other times, the person might need to be around friends doing fun things and moving forward with life without a direct focus on their loss. The length and number of these phases is different from person to person and changes over time. This is the healthy way to grieve, and as such, these phases should be supported by the people around the bereaved as much as possible. One suggested theory of grief combines the following 3 concepts. The first concept is subconscious-conscious integration. This is the process of integrating difficult emotional experiences into one's life story. The person must gradually move past a projective mindset in order to consciously restore difficult emotions. The second concept is immersion distraction, which is similar to the dual process model, stating that a person needs time to focus on trauma, as well as to engage in other life activities and distractors. The third concept is opening the mind to possibilities. This is the building of a new identity apart from what was lost and exploring the possibilities that life has in store for the future. While it can be bittersweet letting go of your loss as a central part of your life, this phase is vital for continuing to live life to the fullest going forward. Finally, I want to discuss a few methods for coping with loss. One strategy is to look for support. Do not retreat into yourself all the time. Find someone who will listen to you and perhaps share in your emotions. Potentially joining a support group is an option for those looking for additional support, as people in those groups typically share in their experiences. Focus on physical health. Physical health plays an important role in mental well-being. Eat well, stay active, and keep a consistent sleep routine. Be aware of triggering events. Encountering things that remind you of your loss, such as dates, locations, or activities, can cause an emotional response. Understand that this is normal and prepare for it to happen. Find or maintain hobbies. Engaging in any activities that you might enjoy can act as a major coping mechanism. If you are unable to enjoy old activities you used to love, take time to discover new ones and adopt them into your routine. Hone your spirituality. If you are religious, turn to your faith as a support. Otherwise, there are many mindfulness practices out there that may help. Seek a therapist or counselor, especially if the grieving process is lasting longer or is more severe than expected and is affecting your daily functioning. Thank you for listening. I hope this provided valuable insight into the experiences of grief and loss. Here are my references, and here are the rest. Thank you.